I've been making a lot of different videos showing bizarre and sometimes paradoxical results when it comes to COVID-19 vaccines. For example, the data showing that COVID-19 vaccines can increase your cancer risk, but at the same time protect you from all-cause mortality in comparison to non-vaccinated. And today I'm going to finally explain biologically how these results might potentially be real, including also the paradoxical result that cancers could expose you to higher risk, vaccines could expose you to higher risk of cancers, but at the same time, same vaccines could sensitize you towards successful anti-cancer treatments. So my name is Dr. Mikola Rashik of Our Genomics, and let's get started. And the first thing I want to do, one of the videos dedicated to UK data, which indeed showed elevated protection from all-cause mortality in COVID-19 vaccinated compared to non-vaccinated. And this was also dose related. And one of the questions I mentioned is this protection we're seeing, temporary protection from all-cause mortality, whether there might be an effect related to vaccine type. And there is an answer to this question, as a matter of fact, and I'm going to tell you about this. And this came from a paper that was published by this famous vaccinologist duo. I'm calling them vaccinologists because they're investigating the effects of vaccines on population of children in Africa. And they were, I believe it was Dr. Christine Benn and I believe it was Dr. Peter Abbey. And they are famous for a couple things, famous and infamous. They were some of the first scientists that showed non-vaccine, non-specific effects. They really actually brought it to the forefront of our scientific understanding. Before them, this concept wasn't really understood. What is that non-specific vaccine effects is the concept that vaccines have other biological effects besides protecting you against the disease that they're designed for. Believe it or not, before we simply thought, hey, that's it, that's all vaccines do. And they clearly have other effects as well. And these guys showed that vaccines against measles when used in Africa were protecting children from other illnesses besides measles. So of course, when they were showing this data, they were heroes. But later on, they also showed that other types of vaccines could have negative non-specific effects, such as increase mortality in girls. And of course, when they showed that data, they became infamous and shunned by the industry because, unfortunately, science does not like ever presenting anything negative against vaccines. Now, these guys, because they are experts on non-specific effects of vaccines, they also investigated COVID-19 vaccines, and they wanted to focus on death, mortality. They investigated the randomized clinical trials for all these vaccines, and they compared mRNA shots versus adenoviral vector vaccine. I believe it was an Oxford one or AstraZeneca. And what they showed is that for the Pfizer vaccine, it didn't have much of a protection in the clinical trial in comparison to the placebo. The hazard ratio was 1.03, and it wasn't statistically significant, meaning the death rate was similar in the placebo group as well as in the vaccine group. However, I can also tell you that there was some monkeying around with that data based on some of the published forensic analysis of the Pfizer data. So please check that video out. And when it came to the adenoviral vaccines, there was definitely a protective effect against death. And they were showing that people who took the vaccine had hazard ratio of death of 0.37 in comparison to the control group, the placebo, meaning they were less likely to die for any reason than the placebo, meaning that the adenoviral vaccines are 3 times less deadly than mRNA vaccines if you want to compare it like this. And the interesting part is I actually mentioned this in one of the articles I was involved in, and one of the co-authors wrote to me and said, Mikolaj, we actually answered the very question you posed in the video in one of the articles we wrote. And I did a video on that article, which was talking about vaccine non-specific effects, and we discussed the idea that if you're doing childhood vaccination, to potentially consider using live attenuated vaccine as the very last vaccine to reduce any negative non-specific effects of vaccines. So check that video out and the corresponding article. All right, let's move on to the next section. I wanted to give you one more set of data that shows these paradoxical results that vaccines, COVID-19 vaccines, protect against mortality while at the same time elevating cancer risk. However, the authors, this study is from Denmark. It actually came out in 2024, so it's one of the earliest ones. And the authors of that study did that study to show how inaccurate data sets can be in terms of painting a picture. They wanted to exhibit the issue that you can really well compare a vaccinated group to non-vaccinated group because they are so different. The results are spurious. They literally show wrong results, and they focused on the likelihood of dying from COVID between the vaccinated versus non-vaccinated group, as well as negative control effects, I believe is how they referred it. Basically, we're talking about effects that should have nothing to do with vaccines. So they looked at information such as malignant melanoma, skin cancer, prostate biopsy, but then you might think, well, wait a minute, maybe vaccines could be influencing cancer. But they also did other things. They also looked at cataract surgery, eye and ear exams, and even mammogram exams as well. So things that should have nothing to do in relation to vaccines. Vaccines should not cause you to have these tests. And they looked at 60,000 vaccinated people versus 60,000 non-vaccinated people in a Danish group of people who were 60 years old and older, and they matched them for everything under the sun. I'm exaggerating. They matched them for age, gender. They matched them for even geographical region that they were living at in Denmark, but they also matched them for how often they were making visits to a hospital, and so that shows you the healthcare use. And despite all of this, this is what they showed. First of all, they showed that those who were vaccinated had higher risk of being infected by SARS-CoV-2, which is paradoxical because vaccines are supposed to protect you from that in comparison to non-vaccinated. By the way, there's some other data that also shows this information. I did a video on this, and it even showed that the more vaccines a person took, the greater the risk of infection they had in comparison to the non-vaccinated. But they said, look, this is obviously a wrong observation. Something is amiss. And all of those negative effects that should not be observed, all of them were at elevated risk in the vaccinated group. The least one was I believe was eye exam. The hazard ratio was 1.15. Hazard ratio tells you how much are you more likely to observe an event in one group over the other. So hazard ratio of 1 means there is no difference between the two groups. If it's higher than 1, means that one group has higher risk of or more probability of observing the event than the other group. And if it's below 1, it means they have lower probability of observing the event than the other group. So 1.15 means that COVID-19 vaccinated group was 15% more likely to go for an eye exam than the non-vaccinated group. And clearly vaccine should have nothing to do with this. And it went all the way to hazard ratio of 3 for the malignant melanoma, meaning those who were vaccinated were 3 times more likely to experience malignant melanoma than non-vaccinated. Prostate biopsy was somewhere around 1.8. The mammogram exam was something around hazard ratio of 2. So you can see they were worse off for everything. And they showed this graph where it indicates that the vaccinated group clearly was doing all of these events at much greater rate than non-vaccinated group. And vice versa, when they looked at causes of death, they looked at cause of death for COVID, and the vaccinated group was dramatically reduced risk of cause of death. Their hazard ratios was something of like below 0.25, I think it might have been 0.23, meaning they are more than 70% less likely to die of COVID. Okay, that makes sense. But they looked at other causes of death. They had hazard ratio of 0.5 of dying from heart attack or stroke. So 50% less likely to die from heart attack or stroke than the non-vaccinated people. They had even 50% likelihood of dying of any cancer, even though they had higher risk of developing cancer. And okay, maybe again, vaccines somehow could explain that, but they even had lower risk of dying from events like trauma. So that should have nothing to do with vaccine, or head injury, nothing to do with vaccine, right? So even those risks were lower. So the authors argue what we're seeing is effects that are not real, and it shows you that these even large data sets can show abnormal results to us, and it introduces biases. And the bias here is the famous healthy vaccinee bias. The idea here is that people who took vaccines are more likely to look for healthy lifestyle and seek healthcare resources in order to protect themselves. And as a consequence, the reason why we're seeing, for example, elevated chances of eye exams and prostate biopsies, because they use healthcare more often than the non-vaccinated. We're not really truly comparing apples to apples, despite all the attempts even at matching these groups. So that's excuse number one, and that's one of the most common answers you, the audience, have been writing in the comments to these videos I've been posting on the UK and Italy data. But the other one, that the most common suggestion you also mentioned, is that the concept that the non-vaccinated people might have experienced discrimination of how healthcare was provided to them during the pandemic. And I tried to look, there's only one paper that I found from Switzerland where they investigated this. How much were the vaccinated people versus the non-vaccinated people felt they were discriminated against with their healthcare provision, and the non-vaccinated people indicated that they were twice as more likely to claim they were discriminated against during their use of hospital services. And the authors of that Swiss paper even mentioned, as far as they know, they're the first ones to even investigate this information. So the take-home message here is that we don't really have data on this concept. Maybe it's potentially slightly true, and I think everything I'm telling you is playing a role into why we're seeing these results, including the healthy vaccinee effect. But I also think there's other element as well, and I'm gonna call it unhealthy vaccine effect bias. And what does that mean? It means that they have greater tendency to be unhealthy, not because they're living an unhealthy lifestyle, but it's because normally vaccinated people are older people. We've seen that with the Italian data. They have more comorbidities, they're sicker, and as a consequence, they will need to use healthcare more frequently. And this is why we're seeing the results we're seeing in this Danish study. So it's not because the results are spurious, it's just because they are sicker. Now, the argument against that, okay, if that's the case, they should have more comorbidities, and they do, and they should die more frequently, and yet we're seeing the exact opposite. They're not dying as frequently as the non-vaccinated. There seem to be protected. They're dying less frequently. And that's the argument against the unhealthy vaccinee bias. But I'm going to now finally introduce to you the reason why we might be observing these. And this is the protection by regulatory T cells that I might be seeing. So, and I think regulatory T cells might be explaining all of this. And let me explain that to you. But first of all, what are regulatory T cells? Regulatory T cells is a subset of T cells that we have that are supposed to control immune response to your body, and they act like peacekeepers of the immune system. So once the immune system is activated to do its function to help you, to fix you, they're the ones who put on the brakes on the immune system to make sure that the immune system doesn't continue and cause a damage. So they suppress the immune system afterwards. So that's what regulatory T cells will do. So they have suppressive effect. Okay. That's in a nutshell. Now let's go through all the observations one by one and see how it all can be answered from the point of view of regulatory T cells doing this effect. So observation number one, the Danish data, UK data, and Italian data all show reduce all-cause mortality in the vaccinated group compared to non-vaccinated group. And why would that be? Is because regulatory T cells, they don't just suppress immune system, they also protect your organs from failure. They also make sure your organs are working as healthy as possible. There was a great review of that information. We're gaining that understanding how regulatory T cells can go into tissues and reside in your tissues to make sure that indeed, number one, no crazy inflammation is happening, so they can suppress if it is, tone it down so that there's no damage to the organs. Yes, that still happens, but they do even other protective functions to make sure that your organs are protected from damage. For example, they release certain compounds, like similar to, say, like growth factors that will induce certain cells to make sure that they protect the organs. So, for example, macrophages, these compounds that regulatory T cells will release and switch macrophages from M1, which are pro-inflammatory, to M2 type of macrophages, which are no longer pro-inflammatory, they're anti-inflammatory, and they work to repair the tissues. So see, there goes an example like that. There's other examples we see that, for example, when you are infected with a virus, an organ is affected, regulatory T cells go in there to reduce that inflammation, and that is well observed. Certain cancer treatments require to get rid of regulatory T cells because regulatory T cells will dampen the cancer treatment. And we have seen organ damage as a consequence of that, such as hepatitis, dermatitis, myocarditis, and every time you hear itis, it means inflammation. So we've seen that before. So the point is that regulatory T cells can protect your organs from damage. And if you now have more of these because of vaccines, your organs are way more protected. And as a consequence, you might see reduced mortality for any reason, because you have to ask yourself, why are these people dying less frequently? All right. So that's observation number one. Let's continue with the mortality concept. Observation number two, both the UK data as well as Japanese data showed delayed mortality in peaks. So the mortality in vaccinated people started to happen few months after the vaccination event. So I did a video on that as well. And the authors of the Japanese investigation, it's not a published study, so we don't know how good of a data that is, and the way they presented it are argued against the quality of the presentation, but nevertheless they showed us delayed peak. And one of the authors of that study mentioned that they believed this was caused due to immune suppression. That was one of my first clues as to thinking like, how would this be achieved? Versus the UK data. Now let's hope I remember the name of one of the investigators. We were corresponding about the video afterwards. Dr. Martin Fornerod. I really practiced to make sure I pronounce his name this time as opposed to last time I screwed it up. And In our private correspondence, he mentioned that he believes it was vasculitis or inflammation of the blood vessels, and perhaps that needs to take effect over multiple months before that inflammation of blood vessels can cause enough damage to damage organs, and that's why we see this delay in peak of deaths. But I also think, while vasculitis is completely viable concept, and that's indeed might be happening, but it's the regulatory T cells that might have prevented it from taking immediate effect. So that's your observation number 2. Let's continue with mortality. Observation number 3. One of the UK data showed that the mortality effect continued to be and reduced with each successive booster shot or next vaccine shot. So we see you take the vaccine reduces the all-cause mortality in vaccinated. This wanes over time. And when you take the next shot, again, you have that increased protection from mortality. To me, this was the number one argument against the healthy vaccinee bias as an explanation, because healthy vaccinee bias cannot explain this effect of vaccine and continuous effect on on reducing the mortality after when it wanes over time. So there's something biological causing the waning effect and then starting it again, which obviously was correlating with taking a shot. So that the shot can explain this effect. If the shot is with each successive vaccination, you see reboosting of the presence of these regulatory T cells. So that was observation number 3. Now let's move on to cancers. So observation number 4 is that all of the data, the Danish data I just presented, UK data, and the Japanese data, I should mention. Sorry, no. Oh my God, the Danish data as well as the Italian data showed that vaccination elevated the risk of cancer. Now, T cells can also explain that, because as I explained in my prior video dedicated to parasites and cancer, I talked about the regulatory T cells and the idea how taking anti-parasitic medications such as fenbendazole or ivermectin could help fight cancer by fighting parasites, because parasites induce production of regulatory T cells as well. And I explained in that video that regulatory T cells, because they suppress immunity, they have that dual opposite effects. There's this trade-off. While they might protect organs, for example, from damage by suppressing immunity, the suppression of immunity, what it can also do at the same time, it can suppress the immunity from properly recognizing and fighting cancer. And this is not a theoretical concept. This is well established by now. So as an example, there is this paper from 2015 that looked at 76 studies over, I believe, 17 different types of cancer and 15,500 patients in total. And it showed that overall, when regulatory T cells infiltrate the cancer environment, it decreases the survival of cancer patient afterwards. So this is not standard for all cancers, but definitely seen for the vast majority of solid tumor cancers. And the risk hazard ratio increases about to 1.5. So such individuals increase 50% of risk of lower survival than if you do not see regulatory T cells infiltrate the tumor. Why is that? Because once the regulatory T cells are there, they can suppress the immune system from properly fighting cancer. So that explains the potential why we might see reduced mortality, but increased cancer risk development as well. Okay, then let's go in observation number 5. Let's stick with the cancer. Recently, there was a paper showing that mRNA vaccines sensitized cancer individuals to a specific therapy called immune checkpoint inhibitors. And I did a video explaining what these authors observed. And that also makes sense. Why is this? Because checkpoint inhibitors target specific molecule called PD-1. This molecule PD-1 can show up on T cells once they've activated it, so that eventually they can become deactivated via this molecule, and cancer takes advantage of that and deactivates T cells, and it survives, right? And hence you put the antibodies against that molecule, against PD-1 molecule, and you prevent that interaction between cancer cells and T cells, and this is why it's a therapy against cancers. But regulatory T cells also have that molecule, PD-1 molecule, and they use that molecule to also suppress the immune system and shut it off. So when you introduce anti-PD-1 therapy, you can also shut off the effect of those regulatory T cells in that environment. Not only that, you can even manipulate T cells to act more as if they were killer T cells, so they can actually help fight tumor as well. And in that video, I also explain this was only observed within a 3-period month. Afterwards, this effect waned. It waned, and not only did it wane, it started to look potentially worse than non-vaccinated. So once again, there's that temporal effect. And I should have also explained, like, why do we see this for 3 months when I talked about the Japanese data and the UK data? I should have mentioned it's because spike protein eventually wanes, but we know that mRNA vaccines have this unnatural genetic construct where they're using unnatural bases, synthetic uretines, and as a consequence, the genetic construct might last much longer than anticipated, and as a consequence, it might lead to longer production of spike protein, and this longer production of spike protein could be activating T cells into existence for multiple months, and eventually this might wane and disappear. So that's possibility number one. And the other possibility is that eventually we also start producing these IgG4 antibodies, and regulatory T cells play a role in that as well, potentially. And they literally might mask spike protein from the immune system, and this is why we see disappearance of the protective effect of regulatory T cells. The last observation is that the mRNA vaccines and adenoviral vaccines show slightly different effects, but they still correspond in that duality role of Tregs. So, for example, I just mentioned at the start of the video that adenoviral vaccines have greater protection against all-cause mortality than mRNA vaccines, okay? But the Korean data from Seoul also showed us that adenoviral vector vaccines also show the highest risk for cancer development in the vaccinated individuals. So you still have that parallel of dual role, protection of organs from damage via immune suppression, while at the same time increasing the risk of cancer via immune suppression. All right, then the final component that I want to tell you about, well, have we seen regulatory T cells in mRNA vaccinated individuals? And the answer is yes. There's lots of data now coming out. This wasn't looked at the beginning of the vaccination, but now we have some data, and let me give you some examples. In 2023, there was a study on, I believe it was 22 individuals, and they showed that all of these individuals show anti-spike CD4 T cells increase, and CD4 T cells include regulatory T cells as well. And as a matter of fact, regulatory T cells against spike protein constituted more cells than the T cells that were supposed to even fight the pathogen afterwards, right? But what's also more interesting is that these regulatory T cells against spike protein, they also had this molecule called CCR6, I believe. This is from memory, so hopefully I didn't screw that up. But why this is significant? Because this molecule is what brings the regulatory T cells into tissues, so that these regulatory T cells can reside in tissues and protect tissues. So you see, potentially explaining that reduced mortality by elevating protection of tissues. So we're talking about lung, or your blood vessels, or intestines, even your brain. Then next year, there was another study on pregnant women Oh, and by the way, those T cells were functional, meaning they were indeed suppressing the immune system. Year later, similar study on 19 pregnant women. What's interesting here is that 18 out of 19 of these women, after vaccination, again, they showed that elevation of these anti-spike regulatory T cells. But what's interesting is that only 11 out of 18 of them showed any regulatory T cells that didn't target spike protein, just targeting anything. So it shows you that regulatory T cells are not that common. They are constitute small. They make up only a small amount of T cells. So then, therefore, when you have a sudden big amount of them, you can see how it could have a big biological influence. Again, those regulatory T cells were shown to have that CCR6 guiding molecule to guide it to tissues so that tissues could be protected. And again, though, the authors of that study showed that they were functional. And one more study I'll mention in 2025. The reason why this was interesting is because these guys, they were looking at about 60 individuals. Majority of them again showed anti-spike regulatory T cell increase. But what's interesting is that they also looked at types of vaccines, and they showed that Moderna mRNA vaccines resulted in the greatest production of regulatory T cells, followed by Pfizer, which was intermediate, and the last one that they tested was the Janssen vaccine adenoviral, the one that I think you only had to take one shot, and they had the lowest. They didn't check the one that I would have been really interested to see, the Oxford vaccine, the AstraZeneca. It would have been interesting to see. So there is this amount, and all of the production of these regulatory T cells always is accompanied by production of this cytokine called interleukin-10. Why that is important is because you have probably known I've done lots of videos on production of IgG4 antibodies, so antibodies that build tolerance against something. So IgG4 antibodies that are against spike protein will hide spike protein from immune system, so that immune system cannot target it as effectively anymore. And one of the studies that I've covered before showed that interleukin-10 is one of the key cytokines needed in order to start producing IgG4. All right. So there's all of that connected together. The last thing I mentioned is that natural infection can also cause regulatory T cell elevation amount, but it's a little different. You need like acute infection in order to see this. So it works a bit different from vaccination, and that might also explain why vaccinated people had these very different effects, biological effects, than those who were infected. And one more thing that I'll say is that this concept, I'm telling you, I didn't come up with this. I studied this, and I did come up with this thinking, okay, but that hypothesis has actually been proposed numerous times recently, that this is unrecognized benefit, non-specific benefit of vaccines in general, and has been proposed in numerous articles already, that this is something we should be looking and appreciating, that there's one of the interesting side effects of vaccines as well. All right, I'm going to wrap it up here. But first, I'll also mention, please check out my Patreon, and you can vote for, if you're supporting Patreon, you can vote for which videos make it to the YouTube. But one more thing I'll mention is I'm also working on a project right now where I want to create a healthy living guide, and I want to do it with your help of the audience. Tell me what that means to you. I want to collect that information, and I want to create a top 10 guide for people to use, because as far as I understand, the best way to protect your immune system right now is to live as healthy lifestyle as possible. Please like, please share, please subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you next time. Bye, everyone.